All right, 1824. Well, this game did something I didn't really expect, and it's kind of neat to have done it right after 1817, because 1817 really does that same thing by introducing more complex economic manipulation to it. And what that is to create a game that's incredibly that gives the capability of doing incredibly harsh things to your opponents. Usually that's with economic manipulation in the 18XX series. In fact, when I looked at 18XX, when I looked at 1830 for the first time, the thing that amazed me was just how devastating you could be to your opposition. In crippling sorts of ways, through a combination of stock manipulation, raping companies, manipulating the train flow, all kind of stuff, all kind of little levers. Well, 1817 gave you lots more economic levers, and it feels very harsh and true to that 1830 economic manipulation game. This is not. This is a Lani game, which tends to be more representing the track laying and the building companies up, getting the dots in the right places and stuff like that. However, I usually actually really respect the way that he handles that. He creates more interesting games than I usually think are possible. But in this particular case, he created one of the most violent, harshest games that I've seen in the 18XX series, just by using those track building type mechanisms. Now, some of them are problematic. One of the things with the economic side that I mentioned was that usually the harshness in those is driven by a strain for realism. The realistic, if you apply competitive principles to the business world, and the real life business world is not that competitive for the most part, except for in some very limited industries where somebody's trying to gain a monopoly. The railroad industry isn't really that competitive. But if it were, and you could manipulate things in such a way and try to collapse, other holders' investments in the same way, not necessarily their capability of running a decent corporation, which is where usually the cutthroat tactics are. But no, you're actually cutthroating their business interests, their financial interests as a holder of that corporation. That's you kind of see that with some hedge funds, but we'll leave that alone, because I'm not sure that would be an interesting game to make. But the more realism that you put into those economic systems, the more opportunities for economic manipulation, the more capability you have to actually damage someone else, especially if you take away certain restrictions of legal aspects that prevent monopolies and such not. And I think 1817 does a good job of that, and a lot of the 18XXs do. They usually don't present a tremendously realistic vision anyway. This one kind of says, I'm going to wash my hands of that realism thing. I'm going to design the sort of harshest, most competitive track-laying, dot tokening platform that I can. That's how I see this. And I was kind of shocked to see just how impressive it is. The game has a few salient points that allow this. First of all, an exceedingly limited track supply. That means with the board that it has, which is fairly open, and there's not a lot of channels going through it, you're still able to play the kind of games that you are in 1830, which has more of a limited access to certain areas, simply because, hey, I took your track. You can't do this. Add to that a fairly large number of tokens compared to the number of important cities that need to be tokened, and you end up with strangleholds on each other's position. Another mechanism that's here is this dual train route, which, well, that's part of it. The dual train route with players building track for the different types of trains. It's not specifically different track. It's using the same pieces. It's just one set of trains runs better on doinkers, the other set does not. And they'll both last the whole game, and they're both very powerful and balanced choices. So you kind of have to choose which set of routes you want to play, and that's one of the things that makes the tight track, the tight tile manifest exceedingly important. Is there's not just one clear type of track that can go through a given area. So you basically have competing types of routes running through, and if you're running on the wrong kind of track, you just don't make the kind of money that you want to make in either case. Okay, another factor is the train upgrade. Every train can basically be upgraded by the from the immediately preceding train. This gives every player a lot more control over the train flow. Quite often, you're jiggling around with stock prices and stuff like that in 1830 to try to see who can get the initiative on, purchasing a given train, or can avoid having to make the choice first, whatever. In this, everybody has the tools in their own hand, if they have the cash, to be able to choose the pace at which the trains come out. And they don't have to be limited to the kind of track that they have. In a lot of cases, you're looking at, well, I could take a really big hit to try to push the trains out faster. In this game, you generally can improve your own company's position, increase the flow of the trains, but it's only a temporary improvement to your company's position. There's always a cost to the trains that you're bringing out, in terms of when they go away, they cost more than the train you had, or whatever. So that's another key factor towards making this harsher. Something that's not involved, I think, particularly in making the game harsher, is it's got sort of a it's the corporate capitalization, corporate floating rules, whatever. Most of the corporations in the game are largely controlled by the miners that you purchase at the beginning of the game. More on that too. You don't bid them. It's sort of like an 1835 design for the miners, but they're all available to you at once, and it uses a reverse snake. So whoever's going last gets the first pick. Whoever's got the priority for the first stock round, whatever, gets to take 2 picks in a row. So they can take 2 very complementary things that are left, and then you filter back, and the guy who picked first gets to pick last again. And then you just start flowing around under the normal conditions, which means there will still be miners available to the players to pick. Assuming all the miners come out, there's only one corporation that's up in the air for being floated, and it can be floated right at the beginning of the game. It doesn't look terribly impressive at the beginning of the game, but in both the games that I've played, it's actually, maybe because of the timing of how it comes out, because of how it capitalizes, and it isn't just, you're not forced into, well, this is the turn this one starts, essentially, or, well, I better start this now with the coal companies. You're put in a position where you get to choose that sort of optimal moment. But, anybody gets to choose, and to some extent, the optimal moment is actually when you can do it first, because there's only one of them. It is possible for some of the other corporations to be in the same position where they can just be capitalized and started whenever. That's if somebody doesn't buy the miners that they're associated with. You do have a dichotomy between the two different types of miners. You have pre-state railroads, which collide multiple miners into one kind of centralized rail that's sitting presumably in some pretty good cities that you really want to be able to run through, and you want to have track that goes through them that's nice and all that. And then and there's 3 of these state-run corporations, each of which has at least 2 miners that fall into it. One of them has 3. And then you have 4 regional railroads, but you actually have 5, but you have 4 that come from coal mine companies. The coal mining companies are kind of weird. They start the game out laying the track for what are the G trains. The G trains are ones that really like hitting dots because they're the little towns, because they don't get charged for them. They have additional income that goes into their company treasury because they have to start at a coal mine, and that gives them that additional cash. And they have pretty good runs at the beginning of the game. However, they're on the fringes of the map, and they have a harder time getting their way into that central area of the map. And even if they start early, they have less tokens than the bigger corporations. Now, the one loose corporation out there is not one of the state-run corporations. It is counted as a regional. It's got less dots, but it starts at kind of a easy to access the centralized area, or easier to access the centralized area. So you have a lot of decisions that you make right at the beginning of the game, because what you're going to be doing is so influenced by the miners that you pick. This is, in some ways you could say, well, that's kind of like 35. Nah, this is far, far more fluid than 35. In 35, you kind of take the miner. Usually there's like one miner that you might want. And the only choice is how much cash you want to put in. You have that flexibility as to how much cash to put into a miner for the coal companies, and you really don't want to put too little in them, but you want to balance your choice as to what you put in them to make sure that you get a full slate of shares at the beginning of the game. Because unlike almost every other 18xx game, there's nothing to invest in for the first couple of sets of operating rounds. And that can be very confusing. You're sitting there collecting cash up and you're like, I want to put it somewhere. I don't have enough to start the one railway that I could start. I could buy shares that don't produce money, those are available in terms of, they give you, strength in the future corporation that's going to turn into. So that's kind of interesting there. Let's talk a little bit, I guess, about the components before I kind of hit the final thoughts, although I think you've got them. You've got a bunch of boards, the share price, the corporate. There's no bank pool, there's just this corporate holding. This is the bank, these are the shares in the bank. You pay the bank, they pay, they don't pay dividends to players or anything. You've got some reserved shares to handle the special companies, and then the complicated train progression. All nice stock, really nice stuff, lower quality. You got the main board, which is, like I said, there's not a lot of terrain on here that's impenetrable. There's a little bit you have to pay for, but you actually have cash in most of your corporations. So all the miners throw half their money into their company treasury. Once they become corporations, though, they become more problematic. And that's why you want to connect up to the coal mines, because the coal mines throw some cash into your corporate treasury. And that's an immediate asset for the coal mining companies. You have to be careful with a lot of things in this game. There's a lot of opportunities to fuck things up royally in this game. On the other side, there's a map for smaller numbers of players, which is actually a different map, isn't it? So yeah, it's a slightly different map. I don't know. You got Vienna, but then so Vienna's right here. It's not really in the center of anything. There's some track that's missing. You have this connection here. Wow, I haven't looked at this at all. Anyway, this holds 2 or 3 players, and you have another variant which adds more dots to the main map, so that the coal trains become more powerful. I feel like they're pretty damn powerful as it is, so I'm not really sure what would happen with that variant. I haven't looked at it too much. Other than that, to tell you the truth. Does it change the trains? Nope. No, it keeps the same train pool, which is gonna be weird. Alright. The rule book is a little fuzzy and not as clear as it could be in certain locations. The components are wonderful for the most part. Nice thick track components. You got your wooden pieces that are all the vogue right now, but, and I like this, you got counters to duplicate all of them. Why is this so good a thing? Well, in general, I like the wooden pieces, and I use them while I played here. But when you have a lot of companies in a game, and you don't in this one, it can be very helpful to have regular counters that don't create a huge stack if they're all in the same location. The stock price chart and being a big two-dimensional chart and the limited number of companies meant that you didn't usually have a stack that was more than 2 or 3 counters, so no big deal. Nice laminated stock on the corporate charters. Same thing with the cards. Give you a pile of custom play money. That's okay. So yeah, I mean the components are top-notch quality. The box is a little flimsier than it could be. Chris, I ended up buying the one that I got because I thought it was going cheap because the box was damaged. And then there was another one that was cheaper. Let me look very quickly to see if there's anything that I missed that I really want to talk about here. You got the variable number of operating rounds, the way you do in 1830. Anything else funky as hell? Beep, 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 beep. The phase changes. This may be the case with a lot of Lonnie's games, but they're not quite what I'm used to, and that can cause me issues. Like I said, there were a couple of ambiguities in the rules. They can be resolved either they're resolved on the online forum or elsewhere. But yeah, overall, I thought that this was a pretty damn competitive and a very exciting game, especially at the beginning of the game. The end tends to drag a little bit, well, more than a little bit. The end in XX games often drags, and in this one, it definitely does. You get to a point where most of the important stuff's been done, and you're just running for money. But unlike some of the games where you can kind of say, and I've seen this in some of them, where the rules are actually like, just spreadsheet everything, screw it, you're not going to be able to change your valuations by much. In this one you actually can. It's possible that you can break into an area that can significantly change your valuation of your runs. And although other players may be trying to stop you, I think as many times as not, you're going to be able to get a significant boost in your run, which might be 10 or 20% of your run value just increasing. You might even double your run with certain companies that are struggling. They started late or something like that. But you have a really, really interesting pile of decisions, starting from what miner you want to pick up, how you want to develop the track around it, when you want to, if you have control over that, when you want to convert it to a corporation. You may even be able to have some control over the state-run corporations because you have so much power over the trains that are available and the train flow. Every player does that. You may be able to push your company out to a more fortunate advantage for yourself. So there's a lot to think about here. I feel like this is as big of a complex, weaved together puzzle as 1817 is. And where there's not a lot of sign that it's like the modern heavy Euro where it's like, oh, once somebody figures out the trick of a strategy or whatever, the optimal strategy, they figured the game out, and that's kind of what the whole box is about. It's an 18XX, that's not going to be the case for the most part. But also, I don't know where I'm going with this. Anyway, so many of the modern Euros follow this kind of idea of we're going to obfuscate what you should be doing. This is kind of open. The things you should be, especially if you're an XX player, the things you should be doing are pretty damn obvious. How to manipulate the game to do them is not quite as obvious, and where it really kind of, where the complexity really blooms is the fact that all these things interlock, and it's almost obvious that there's no killer strategy for this. And that there's not like a rock, paper, scissors type situation where if one person's doing this, you should do that. I would guess that the general rules of trying to play it a little differently from everyone else will probably work, but maybe not in this one because the different track types. If a bunch of people are building one type of track, you want to be in on that. You don't want to be the only person building, the coal mining track, and then everyone takes advantage of your coal mining track, and you're not in a position to take advantage of their regular track, or whatever you want to say. But here's the problem. I'm not a big fan of calculating routes, of optimizing the routes, of trying to play that cutting track and the dots and all that. I like that in XX, but to me it's sort of a necessary burden. It adds to the flavor and pleasure in the game, but it can be overdone. And this game takes it, to the limit, essentially. And you would say, well, gee, you must hate this then. And the answer is no, I don't. But I do feel that heavy burden, especially in the late game, that I would rather not be there. But I don't think that it's possible to make an XX that's not reliant on all these economic manipulations, stock manipulation, loans, stuff like that, that is convoluted enough to provide the kind of challenge that this provides, without it including a really heavy element of spaghetti track that you might not be able to completely figure out until it starts to develop. And yes, I do find that a painful aspect of it. It gives me headaches. I screw things up because of it. But it really fits in well with this one. And I think this is one, I mean, I was torn with, wow, is this as impressive as 17 except in the other way? Well, maybe, but I'm not able to judge that in the sense that I've got too big a bias against that kind of play. However, I did get enough fun out of this compared to most games that are really reliant on that track and token competition type stuff. I think I'm seeing the games are coming together better that use that kind of mechanism. So anyway, yeah, this was pretty cool. Unlike, I don't know, some of the games I've seen recently, and I think some of these Lonnie games originally. The GMT one that was released, 4454 or whatever, I think that's this pair. That one relied on different trains and different special maps and different type of track and stuff like that. Here, the different types of track is just integral to the 18XX. It's not like different gauges or anything weird like that, and I prefer that. I'm not. It does complicate though that decision making as to which tracks work. Yeah. All right. That's all I'm gonna say. Let's put her on.